So welcome everyone. It's really good to see you tonight. Hope you've had a really good afternoon as well. Tonight we're going to be thinking about this question: is Christianity good for the world? So we've got 6 till 7 o'clock tonight. Enough time to, what do you do on Sunday nights? Make the fat lunch, get iron the shirts, whatever it might be, ready for Monday. Everyone's like, yes, I need to do that now. I forgot. So we've got this hour together thinking about this question. And you might laugh at this. I like to think of myself as not that old. Some people are thinking, no, you really are old. Others again, you're not that old. But in my lifetime, there's been a fair amount of change. The birth of the internet happened since I was born. Creation of the mobile phone. At first, some of you remember the brick that you used 2 hands to hello, sort of speaking. Now, trillions of possibilities just in your pocket with a smartphone. Huge changes, huge inventions. Others will remember 2014, another notable invention of the selfie stick. Remember that? 10 years ago? No, that's not quite as big a one, is it? There we go. But inventions, they haven't been the only changes that have taken place. There's also been significant cultural shifts in beliefs and behaviours. And there's a really interesting book. I can't promise I've read every page of it, but a book called Generations by a lady called Jean Twenge. Really, really interesting book. That one of the many things she analyses is the changes of attitudes within different generations. Millennials, boomers, silent generation, Gen Z, those kind of things. And she tracks particularly changes in attitudes towards religion and Christianity. And even within my lifetime, there's been significant change. See, whilst Christianity has exploded in the global south, amongst other places, actually in the West, it seems like religion or Christianity is often waned. And Jean Twenge and others show those shifts, like broadly speaking. And it could be like this: but before I was born, or in the early years of my life, Christianity generally was viewed positively in society, as it was seen as a force for good, a respected voice, a valuable institution. Broadly, okay, not all the time, but broadly, that was kind of how it was seen. As I grew up, kind of in the middle there, when I was at school, Christianity perhaps started to be viewed a little bit more neutrally, a little bit dull, a little bit irrelevant, but fairly harmless. Think kind of Father Ted, Vicar of Dibley. You guys are like, what on earth are you talking about? There you go, Google it, or maybe don't. So kind of fairly neutral, fairly harmless. But actually in more recent years, mid to late kind of noughties, the Christianity started to be viewed increasingly as negative, be viewed negatively in society. Not just irrelevant, but irrational, immoral. New atheists came about. Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris and others made the case that we're actually better off without religion. They often took their aim particularly at Christianity. And it's a narrative that's kind of caught on more broadly, that religion, Christianity, is bad for the world, bad for society, bad for individuals. As Christopher Hitchens famously put it, religion poisons everything. And maybe you're here tonight and you're a guest and you feel, yeah, that might be true. Maybe there's something in that. I want to ask, what is it that's led them, the new atheists, if you like, and others to that conclusion? That Christianity isn't just kind of neutral in the middle, but it's actually a negative thing. What has led to that? I don't think there's a straightforward answer, but often arguments are made pointing to the past and to the present. See, some people would point to the past and say, all you need to do is just look at things like the Crusades in history, or the historical legacy of slavery, or links with colonialism, and well, Christianity's track record is not great. It's got some serious questions to answer for. Others would point to kind of, Christianity is anti-science or anti-progress. Ed did a brilliant Big Questions you can listen to. It's on our YouTube channel about some of those things. But some would say, yeah, it wasn't until the Enlightenment, if it means anything to you, in the 17th, 18th century, that saved humanity from the repression of the Dark Ages and the church. Others, they would point to the present and problems that they have with Christianity now. We had a bit of work done on our garden a few weeks ago, and one of the guys doing it was a guy called Paul, and it was a kind of coffee break, tea break, and I went out to chat to him, and I just said, we got chatting about a load of things. I said, do you ever get along to church or make anything of Christianity? And he was sucking on his strawberry vape. And he was saying to me, one word, Nathan, one word, hypocrisy. Okay, that's hypocrisy. And 1 in 4 Gen Z teenagers would agree. Hypocrisy is a barrier to belief in God. Tragic stories of sexual abuse in the church, bullying, leadership, are all too frequent. And so it's no surprise, just taking this all together, that, I don't know if you saw at the Paris Olympic opening ceremony, what song was it that they chose to feature there? It was John Lennon's Imagine. Imagining a good world without, you guessed it, religion. Yet before we kind of lob Christianity on the rubbish pile and get rid of it, it's striking that there's a number of contemporary deep thinkers in recent years who have actually talked about the positive impact that Christianity has had in the West, Western culture, civilization, even though some of them wouldn't call themselves Christians. Some of them have gone as far as kind of mourning the lack of kind of Christian decline in the West, or the danger they've warned about of rejecting our Christian heritage. You might have come across some of these names, Jordan Peterson. He regularly talks about the benefits of Western society that spring from the roots of Christian heritage. Tom Holland as well, not the Spider-Man Tom Holland. That'd be cool if he said something on this. But Tom Holland is a historian, he's kind of top 10 podcasts pretty much all the time. People are listening to him a lot. And he said this, bit of a long quote, but just go with me on this. He said, today, even as belief in God fades across the West, the countries that were once collectively known as Christendom continue to bear the stamp of the 2 millennia old revolution that Christianity represents. It's the principal reason why, by and large, most of us who live in post-Christian societies still take for granted that it's nobler to suffer than to inflict suffering. It's why we generally assume that every human life is of equal value. He says this, in my morals and my ethics, I have learned to accept that I'm not Greek or Roman at all, but thoroughly and proudly Christian. I'll unpack that a little bit more later, but there's other names as well. You might or might not recognise some of these people that are speaking in similar themes to this. Louise Perry, Douglas Murray, James Marriott, is a Times journalist as well. All of them, to some extent, arguing we need Christianity. We need it. It's good. And there's some of them seeing signs that there is a move back, a shift back to God. Listen, I'm aware that in one evening there's a limit of how much we can cover. But my aim really is to show us tonight that we are not better off without Christianity, but that it is good for the world. I want us to see, one, that many of the values and freedoms that we cherish most in the West are actually profoundly Christian, and they've not come out of nowhere. And two, that Christianity has been and is a positive force that transforms communities and individual lives for the good. We'll have a bit of discussion throughout, have a Q&A hopefully at the end. But just with a couple of people near you, maybe eat some crisps, have a bit of a chat about this for a few moments. A positive, neutral or negative force in the world, which one resonates with you out of those? Be honest, in a group, and maybe people that you talk to when it comes to the impact of Christianity. So kind of like, is it really positive? Is it great that Christianity's there? Is it kind of, is it, oh no, negative? What would you say? What would others say? A couple of minutes just to chat, and then we'll come back together. So I've mentioned some of the kind of negative associations with the church and with Christianity that we'll come back to a little bit later. But I want to first see the significant influence that the Christian faith has had, particularly in the West. And we could explore loads of different avenues of culture and politics and art and music and science and those things. But I just wanted to hone in on three values tonight, which across Western society we cherish, and in truth we take for granted as well. Three values that I want to say are inherently Christian, providing benefits to life and society. And some of this is taken from a really good book by Glenn Scrivener called The Air We Breathe, some of it from a book by Sharon James called Is Christianity Good for the World? nicked her title tonight. That's not copyrighted. And actually both of those books are, I forgot to mention, but take a lot of stuff, borrow a lot of things from Tom Holland's book, Dominion. So everything's sharing, but I'm using those things a little bit here tonight. And I want to look, so three values, the first of which is equality. Come back with me, if you dare, to 2020 and lockdown. And you'll remember that there were some heated moments, it would be fair to say, in kind of nationwide public anger. You might remember Dominic Cummings' car journey up to Barnard Castle. You might remember Partygate. But there was another moment, I don't know if you remember, with a guy called Lord Sumption. Fantastic name. He was a Supreme Court Justice, or previously a Supreme Court Justice. And he was on a TV show during kind of lockdown. And he argued, Lord Sumption's argument was that the elderly were more affected by COVID, but the young were more affected by lockdown. Therefore, lockdown had been punishing too many for the greater good. Now, that prompted a question. Well, if you don't lock down, are the elderly to be sacrificed for the good of the young? Fair question. And Lord Sumption said this. He said, my children's and my grandchildren's lives are worth much more than mine because they've got a lot more of it ahead. I don't accept that all lives are of equal value. He said this on the TV show. Cue outrage, kind of keyboard warriors, blasphemy. How can he say this? How can he say this? One lady on the TV show had cancer, and she took issue with Lord Sumption. And she said, who are you, Lord Sumption? I don't know if she said it like that. I'm just going to go for that. Who are you, Lord Sumption, to put a value on life? In my view, she said, and many others, life is sacred. And I don't think we should make those judgment calls. All life is worth saving, regardless of what life it is people are living. Let's get a big round of applause to her. And I guess most of us, maybe all of us in this room would agree. But why? Here's the question. Why do we applaud when someone says that all lives are of equal value? Why do we do that? So you travel back to the ancient world in Greece, Aristotle, Plato, and they would have sided with Lord Sumption and say, of course we're not all equal. There's masters and slaves and men and women and slaves and children. Aristotle might have said, oh, it's a nice idea that we're all equal, but show me how. Where are you getting this magical concept of equality from? But given our modern beliefs, Aristotle, like Lord Sumption, he would have been booed off stage for his views. See, we desperately want to hang on to the belief of equality, but where do we find it? Can we find it in science? Well, no. According to another book written by a guy, Yuval Noah Harari, he wrote this book, Sapiens. I think it came down just maybe before the lockdown, but everyone kind of, not everyone, that's an exaggeration. Lots of people were reading it, looking for answers for life's big questions during that time. And Yuval Noah Harari says, science tells us nothing about our equal status in relation to one another. He says there's no intrinsic thing as human rights. It's just a made-up thing. It's a story we tell ourselves. That leaves the big question, well, how and why do we value people? I want to say we need an eternal creator to bestow on us that value, equality and dignity, which is revealed in the first page of the Bible in Genesis chapter 1. Maybe familiar verses for some here tonight. But God says this, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. See, humanity's role is not to be a slave, but to reign, male and female, like kings and queens, stamped with the image and likeness of God. Now, Glenn Scrivener in his book says this, he said, modern people, moderns, may yawn at that idea, ancients would choke on it. So materially, you and I, we're just base and brittle. Our lives are really brief, aren't they? But we are also breathed upon by God. See, Aristotle, Plato, they would be outraged by the idea that human beings are in any meaningful way distinct from ants. Yet in the 21st century, the roots of Christianity, that we're made in the image of God with value and dignity, that's shaped our modern beliefs. Tom Holland asks what remains of equality and human rights without such a belief in God. He said it's like a branch being cut from the tree that it grew on. A friend of mine spent a bit of time in a Soviet, kind of Eastern European country that was run in a kind of very secular regime. Religion was banned, Christianity was banned in this country. And her experience of being there during that time, she said, you go to the hospital. She went to a hospital, and she said people were being treated appallingly, just like slabs of meat. People being left in corridors on trolleys, kind of half naked, and no one seemed to care. And her analysis, you might disagree, but was when you don't have these things underpinning a society, well, what's to say that's wrong in any way? As Glenn Scrivener puts it, if we feel that life is sacred, special, and that every human being possesses dignity and equality, that no one deserves to be trampled down simply because they're smaller or weaker or poorer, then we're standing, he says, on particularly biblical foundations. If we find ourselves saying amen to those things, we're more shaped by Christianity than we think. Let me pause at this point. Any reflections, comments on that? Maybe questions? We might return to them later, just before we move on. Anyone still awake? No. Thinking. Good. Let's move on to the next one. So we've seen equality. We've seen freedom. That's a big thing. We cherish that, don't we? Particularly in the West. And during the pandemic, I don't know, does anyone remember this picture? Who was it? Do you remember? Colston. Anyone got first name? Thought you got that, Joe. Joseph. I mean, it's not actually that important, but Edward Colston, and his statue that went down in Bristol, didn't it, into the river. He was a slave trader, and when this happened, the cheers of the country, or the crowd certainly there at this point, as he was dumped kind of into the river. And the argument was very clear that a man who had overseen 84,000 African men and women and children captured and shipped across the Atlantic for obscene profits should not be honoured in public life with a statue. That was the argument. And leaving aside the kind of discussions of the pros and cons or legalities of tearing down statues, which was well on time, there was a national sense that this man had done grave wrong. He should not be honoured. He had ignored what we tonight, I guess, see as blindingly obvious, that this is no way to treat fellow human beings. Now, it's famously put in the US Declaration of Independence. If any of you know the musical Hamilton, you might be singing along at this point. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Do you see how the Declaration puts it? This is self-evident. It's obvious. It's as self-evident as the fact that a triangle has three sides, or that tomorrow morning is going to be Monday morning. But I want to ask, is it really self-evident, or is it a distinctly Christian value? See, if you've grown up in the UK, you've likely taken freedom for granted. But again, the idea that every human being is of equal in dignity has not been common and obvious in most cultures. And the Roman Empire, roughly 10 million out of 70 million were slaves. And it's not just in the past. Today, it's estimated 27.6 million people are victims of sex trafficking and forced labour. I think it was Monday this week, I don't know if you saw it. Even a McDonald's in Cambridgeshire was in trouble because it failed to spot 9 victims of modern day slavery working pretty close to here in Cambridgeshire in a McDonald's. Again, the foundation of human rights, very first page of the Bible, Genesis 1. Every human being is equal in dignity and value. Even atheists like Yuval Noah Harari recognise, he says the Americans got the idea of equality from Christianity, which argues that every person has a lively created soul and that all souls are equal before God. However, if we do not believe, this is what he says in the Christian myths about God, creation and souls, what does it mean that all people are equal? Tom Holland again says values that are often considered modern or progressive in our society, such as the importance of protecting the weak, the idea of universal human rights, the belief in the moral equality of all people, have deep roots in Christian teachings. And it is that biblical underpinning or belief that's led Christians to be active in promoting that kind of freedom for all. Let me give you two examples, one historical, one modern. Famously then, historically, Christian opposition to slavery in history. The transatlantic slave trade, I guess you guys have taught about that kind of thing, maybe already have been at school, brought horror on a terrible scale. But it was Christian campaigners, most notably William Wilberforce, driven by their Christian faith, who tirelessly worked for the abolition or end of slavery. When it comes to slavery, the Christian-led abolition was so complete that we share its outlook today as obvious, self-evident. We can't believe that this would have happened or that anyone would think of doing this kind of thing. Yet Tom Holland again shows that the West's commitment to these things is not natural. It's not inevitable, but it's a result of centuries of Christian influence reshaping cultural norms. Society has taken the values wholesale, but denied the source, that's God. And it's not just in the past. I was just struck by something I read. Just getting many sides. Forgot something. I just read something earlier this week. Not just in the past, but today. This is a story of a girl called little Bindia, who was born in the red light district of the economic hub in India, Mumbai, where countless women today are entrapped in prostitution. Bindia's mother died of HIV, and Bindia was rescued by a Christian rehabilitation centre that helps women and girls leave prostitution and break the cycle of sex slavery and trafficking. By the age of 15, Bindia was top of her class at school, with hope of a meaningful future far from the red light district. Her life had been transformed for the better by the Christian gospel. See, Christians often lead the way in opposing slavery and human trafficking worldwide. Organisations like International Justice Mission. And all of this is rooted in biblical principles to challenge injustice. Proverbs would talk about that. To care for the oppressed. Isaiah would talk about that in the Old Testament. Of course, that doesn't mean that Christians are the only ones in the world doing this. I'm not saying that. But the foundations are profoundly Christian. Just with your neighbour, just for a second, maybe just discuss something that struck you, either about equality or freedom through what we just heard. If you thought, oh, something I missed there, I didn't quite get that. Just chat what struck you about equality and freedom, and then we'll come back together in a moment. Okay, let's come back. Great. So we've thought about a couple of things there: equality, about freedom. The third one I want to touch on is compassion. We love compassion. Talk about it. It's valued, cherished in society. And actually, back 10 years ago, 2014, there was controversy on Twitter. I mean, obviously that could be any day and every day. But I don't know if you saw it. A sensitive thing to talk about. It was a pregnant woman, and after finding out that her child would likely be born with Down syndrome, she went onto Twitter and asked about the ethical dilemma that she had of whether to keep the child or not. And Richard Dawkins, the atheist, somehow got involved, I'm not quite sure how, with a comment to her question where he said, abort it and try again. it would be immoral to bring it into the world if you have the choice. Cue outrage in response to that, either from parents, children with Down syndrome, or people with Down syndrome themselves, or others kind of chipping into the debate. And Dawkins tried to kind of clarify things in 140 characters or whatever it was at the time, that only made things worse. It didn't help at all. Yet actually Richard Dawkins' advice, it would have found support in the ancient world. Plato, Aristotle again, talked about disposing of unwanted and weak children. They said it would be immoral not to. And that's a typical view through the centuries then, often, that we are better off without the weak. That has been a motto and lived out by many societies. Why then is there so much controversy over a tweet like this by Richard Dawkins? Well, there is something within us, isn't there, that wants to protect the weak rather than get rid of the weak, which is again a belief more shaped by the Bible than we realise. See, strikingly, when Jesus came to this world, the word that describes his emotional life more than any other is the word compassion. Love and compassion flowed through his interactions with all sorts of people as he performed healings, wept at the friend of a graveside of a friend as he restored life as well. And perhaps most famously this kind of Christian theme of compassion is picked up in the parable of the Good Samaritan. It's famous, isn't it? You remember the story? There's a man and he's kind of left dead at the side of the road. And then one and then two religious leaders kind of walk on past and they carry on their journey. But then there's another man, a Samaritan man. And Samaritans, they were despised. He was from another religion, another nation. Yet the Samaritan shows compassion. He stops. He cares. He takes this man to a makeshift hospital. He pays his bills. And it's firstly a picture of being able to give Jesus' love for us, but it's also a challenge to go and do likewise. And Christians have, albeit imperfectly, been doing that since. And its effects have been profound, forming the bedrock of Western civilization. See, the Greeks and Romans, it's really interesting reading about this. The Greeks and the Romans, they did have sick bays for their slaves and soldiers, but they existed mostly just to kind of get them well and up and fighting and fit again. Christians created something new, healthcare for all. St. Basil the Great, that's a good name, again, 369 AD, he founded a hospital with a ward set aside for lepers, who he cared for, nursed, helped with his own hands. In Rome, a Christian noblewoman called Saint Fabiola in AD 399 established the first public hospital in Western Europe, seeking out those in the street who needed care and attention. And a cascade of hospitals followed. Benedictine monks, responsible for some 2,000 hospitals alone, thoroughly Christian. And today, if you need medical help at some point or another, and a number of this room have had that, what do we look for? The white cross on the green background, or the red cross supporting millions around the world, or a snake on the pole on the ambulance logo. There's a picture of Jesus' death for us, taken from the book of Numbers in the Old Testament. The Good Samaritan, you could say, is assumed. This isn't natural. I hope that's one thing that you're hearing tonight. This isn't natural. It's a biblical foundation. Christianity has been and continues to be good for the world. Debating whether I'm going to do this. I will. Tying some of these themes together then, really interestingly put by a guy called Matthew Paris. He's a journalist. He wrote a lot for the Times, particularly. He's an atheist. He calls himself a Christian. But he puts it so well. Let me just read this for you. He was travelling around Malawi, and he said this: "Now a confirmed atheist, I've become convinced of the enormous contribution that Christian evangelism, that's kind of sharing the good news of Christianity, makes in Africa. Sharply distinct from the work of secular NGOs, government projects and international aid efforts. These alone will not do. Education and training alone will not do. In Africa, Christianity changes people's hearts. It brings a spiritual transformation. The rebirth is real. The change is good. I used to avoid this truth, he says, by applauding, as you can say, the practical work of mission churches in Africa. It's a pity, I would say, that salvation is part of the package, but Christians, black and white, working in Africa, do heal the sick, do teach people to read and write. And only the severest kind of secularist could see a mission hospital or school and say that the world would be better without it. And he finishes like this: those who want Africa to walk tall amid 21st century global competition must not kid themselves that providing the material means or even the know-how that accompanies that, what we call development, will make the change. I'm afraid it has to be supplanted by another thing. Removing Christian evangelism from the African equation may leave the continent at the mercy of a malign fusion of Nike, the witch doctor, the mobile phone, and the machete. He's not a Christian, for his reflection, travelling around Malawi. What about the question then? We're kind of coming into land in the plane. They've just told you to put your seatbelts on, okay? You need that tonight. What about the bad Christianity has done? It's a big question, isn't it? What about the evil, the bad that Christianity has done? It's that's Matthew Paris. There we go. That's a question maybe we have, or we've been asked at various points. Maybe it's the elephant in the room. You know, I say great stuff about the hospitals. We love that. Abolition of slavery, thumbs up. But what about these other things? Let me just say three things really briefly. Firstly, I think it's important to not lump all religions into the same boat. That is the area, I think, often of the new atheists. Islam is very different than being Amish or Buddhism. And it's slightly lazy, potentially offensive, to kind of just throw all these religions into the same category as one whole. That's just, I don't know, I think we want to do better than that. My job, of course, tonight is to focus on Christianity. Second thing I want to note is that it's important to recognise the difference between nominal or institutional Christianity and real, genuine, living Christianity. Jesus says that. In Matthew 7, he says that many will claim to be Christians, but not be. But true Christians are recognised by their fruit, by their lives. We thought about that this morning in the service. So at points in history, people have done great evil in the name of Jesus Christ, but they've often only been Christian in name, acting out of line with what Jesus would want. Does that make sense? Difference in that? The last thing I want to say as well is that genuine Christians are capable of doing great wrong and evil. See, there's a great change that takes place when someone becomes a Christian, but often a life transformation, it can be a process. And so particularly with the slave trade in the UK and in the US, some Christians for far too long failed to recognise their involvement and repent of the evil that they were part of. Christians, genuine Christians, are capable of doing wrong. Ultimately then, as we finish, Christians and Christianity is at its best, I want to say, or most good for the world, when it is pointing people, word and deed, towards Jesus Christ. See, unlike Christians, Jesus was perfectly consistent in living out these values we've talked about tonight. He modelled equality and freedom and compassion. He spent time with people who are despised in society. He was a friend of sinners. He loved the marginalised in society. He truly loved his neighbour as himself. And his mission was to serve, to ultimately serve by laying his life down on the cross for the sake of others. And that's the heart of why Christianity is good news for the whole world. And ever since, whole communities have been transformed by him. Countless millions of lives have been transformed by him for the good. Many at Mighton Church could testify to that as well. So particularly if you're here tonight and you haven't really genuinely ever looked into Jesus, into his life, please do read an account of his life in the Gospels. Find a good modern translation. And you'll see someone whose life was perfect and whose death changes everything, even yours for the good. What I want us to do now, we've got a little bit of time. I want you just to, again, just in your groups for the last time, just think about questions that you might have, anything springing up, things that you think, oh, Nathan, you didn't address this, can't believe it. Let's ask a question about that. Maybe something you're struggling with, you've got a question about. So just a few minutes in groups, and then I'll take a few questions after that. Okay?